Hello and welcome again to another episode of Lost in Science across Australia on the Community Radio Network. My name is Stu, and this week I'm going to be talking to Professor Greg Qiao from the University of Melbourne about a new way to combat bacterial infections which does not rely on antibiotics. Claire will be speaking to Professor Sharon Bell, who is the presenter of the Ruby Payne Scott keynote address at the Women in STEM symposium recently held in Melbourne. And Chris will update us on some good news from the fight against malaria in Sri Lanka. So stay tuned. You are listening to Lost in Science. On the show, we have talked a number of times about worries around the eventual failure of antibiotics in preventing antibiotic-resistant bacteria from making people sick. And I have got Professor Greg Qiao from the University of Melbourne on the line to talk about some recent work that he's been involved in, looking for alternatives to traditional antibiotics. Welcome to Lost in Science, Greg.
Good afternoon, Stuart.
Now, I did mention just then that traditional antibiotics are having problems in combating common bacterial infections. What's causing that problem?
Well, the traditional antibiotics, by nature, it's forming. They will have a resistant mechanism from the bacteria, because that's how the microorganism, how they release these kind of compounds against other microorganism. And so the microorganism produces kind of bacteria would have some sort of defense system, which is kind of mutated like a defense system. So the bacteria, when they had these antibiotics attack on them and basically kill them, they always try to come up with a defense mechanism by mutating their surface protein structure, or even pump some chemicals to destroy these antibiotics. So over many years since the antibiotics were discovered, almost like 70 years ago now, and over time, bacteria start to create the resistance to any new antibiotics which is developed.
So they just over time they develop a resistance to the antibiotics because they keep getting exposed to the same antibiotics.
Yes.
Okay, and has there been any real breakthroughs in those traditional antibiotics recently, or are we still using the ones from 70 years ago?
I think the best time period, perhaps since 1945 to 1985, I think that period we have seen that many new antibiotics discovered through the method which I just kind of mentioned before. So this is really the compounds created by the microorganism in soil, in fact. In the last 30 years, we might only had about 2 to 3, which is really produced. So the rate we are having these new antibiotics are basically slow down substantially. In the meantime, the bacteria's the resistance going a lot faster.
And the work you have been doing in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering, you've been taking a slightly different approach to bacterial infection.
Yeah, our material is not antibiotics. It's actually, we call them peptide polymers. And this particular one is a star-shaped. So we have been making star-shaped polymer for a long time, and mainly for like a industrial paint or or any other rheology control material like engine oil, where you put the star polymer to regulate the engine oil viscosity when you have a cold weather. For example, you want to try to start your engine. But recently, when we start to make this material from amino acids, which is the building block for human body, we will particularly design this star polymer for deliver drugs, because the size of them are around 10 to 30 nanometers. We thought this would be very good as a drug carrier to deliver like a cancer drug. So they can do the purpose of delivering the drug, and then afterwards they can basically break down by the body and then basically go back to the precursor as amino acids, which can also be reused by body to build their own DNA or materials. So what we actually found some years ago, we found when we make a positive charge, the star polypeptides polymer, and we found they have a killing effect. They actually become toxic to some cells. So they made us to rethink the whole strategy. Maybe there is a revenue we can investigate where these peptide-based polymer, if we get the formula right, then they can actually kill the bacteria. So we go to the drawing board and redesign the whole starch polymer with the new amino acids, really looking at how they may be charged to targeting the surface of the bacteria, or how there may be some hydrophobic component which can interact with the membrane so they can take the membrane apart. So we had this principle, and then we redesigned the whole structure, and then we found indeed that if we get a formula right, they can actually kill the bacteria, particularly the drug-resistant bacteria.
So have you tested the peptide polymers in humans yet, or are we still some way from that?
So far, what we tried a number of superbugs, which is the drug-resistant bacteria in the lab in vitro, and also we tried our mice, or that's the in vivo, and the early stage, the results which is published in a paper about 3 weeks ago are very exciting and also very encouraging, because this is the first time in vivo we can see material like peptide polymers can kill bacteria by not using antibiotics, and that really gives us a new thinking. Maybe perhaps there's a real revenue we can investigate to get the medicine and treat these bacteria in the future time.
And is it likely that the bacteria will develop resistance to this kind of treatment, or are they showing no signs of?
Well, we actually deliberately did one experiment with our star polymer, where we actually incubated the bacteria with our star polymer at a lower dose, so that it will not kill the bacteria. And then we let them to grow for 600 generations, which is over 24 days. Now, normally, by that long time, bacteria would start to have resistance. Now, after that, we take the mutated or 600 generations of the bacteria. Then we take our lethal dose of our or you call normal dose, which will kill them in the past, and then test them. And then our star efficacy has not changed. We can still kill these bacteria. That means the bacteria has not produced resistance to our star polymer.
That all sounds pretty exciting, and be interested to hear more about the ongoing work with these peptide polymers to beat the superbugs in the future.
Yeah. That's perhaps this is where I will spend a lot of time in the near future to do this area of work.
Well, thanks very much for joining us on Lost in Science, Professor Qiao.
My pleasure. Yeah.
And we'll keep an eye on your work and see maybe we'll see the products of it in hospitals at some point in the future.
I hope so.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The inaugural Ruby Payne Scott keynote address was given at the Women in STEM and Innovation Symposium in Melbourne in September. The presenter of the keynote address is Professor Sharon Bell, also the chair of the Women in Science in Australia Expert Advisory Board. I caught up with Professor Bell after she presented to hear from her why this keynote address is named after Ruby Payne Scott. Who was she and why is her story so important to tell?
Okay, so Ruby Payne Scott was an absolutely leading radio astronomer in Australia in the early part of the last century, so in the 1940s and 50s. She was a young woman who had grown up in country New South Wales. She'd been educated in schools in Sydney. She gained a scholarship to the University of Sydney, and she went on to be one of our first radio astronomers and our first female radio astronomer in Australia. She was working at a time when the field was very open to new inventions, and the group she was working with radar. They were also becoming aware of the ability and developing the ability to track movements through astronomy that we had never seen previously. Ruby's work was absolutely instrumental in putting Australia on the map in terms of radio astronomy.
Why is it so important to celebrate her achievements today at this symposium?
Really important to celebrate her achievements because she was an outstanding scientist who produced remarkable work within a very short period of time. The other reason to celebrate and be aware of her achievements is that short time was due to the fact that under the circumstances that existed then, she wasn't able to be married and continue her work in an ongoing position in CSIRO because the marriage ban was in place. Marriage bar that had been introduced in the 1940s was in place until 1966 in Australia, which meant that married women could only be in temporary positions, couldn't take on supervisory roles, therefore couldn't get promoted, and were the first to be made redundant at times of redundancy. So there is also a great tragedy in Ruby's career that her career was cut short in a formal sense in terms of her research, but we need to remember that after having a period of just over a decade where she had a family, looked after the family, she returned to be a science teacher. So there was, if you like, a second wave of her career where she obviously had a fantastic effect as a great science teacher in Sydney on generations of young people.
She made the best of a fairly tragic situation.
She made the best of a very difficult situation. I don't know that Ruby would have said tragic. I suspect she was known to be very feisty. She was a member of the Communist Party, so she was politically aware. I think she would have felt that it was a very unjust situation and she would not have accepted it lightly, and we know she didn't accept it lightly, but I don't think she would have been someone, from my understanding of her situation, who would have indulged in self-pity.
In your opinion, how have Ruby Payne Scott's, how has her research informed where we are today with radio telescopes?
The work that she did as a radio astronomer was absolutely critical, as I said, to situating Australia and positioning Australia as a leading force in that field. The field in which she worked was one which was evolving, where you had an understanding that you could use multiple telescopes, what they called interferon, to actually work together to actually track movements and solar developments in the atmosphere and indeed in the universe. That work really, I think you could say, laid the foundations of Australia's really strong expertise in that field. Obviously, she wasn't doing this alone. She was working as part of a team. But the work of those teams meant that the type of work we're seeing now, where we're working as an international collaborator, for instance, on the LIGO project, identifying gravitational waves, is absolutely an antecedent to that contemporary work. And that contemporary work is absolutely at the forefront of astronomy.
Do you think that Ruby has being given enough recognition in Australia for the work that she has done?
It's really hard to judge what would be enough. You could say if her career had not been cut short, she would have undoubtedly been regarded and known as an outstanding scientist. She doesn't have the high profile that she might have had because of that. There is some suggestion that she may well have been part of a Nobel Prize winning team if she had been able to continue as part of that team. But the other side of her contribution was as a mother. She's the mother of one of our most eminent mathematicians, Peter Hall, and also the mother of one of our most eminent artists, Fiona Hall. So as a mother, she's produced these two, fantastic people who've contributed at such a high level in their fields. And as a teacher, she also made a very significant contribution. So if we could actually take that together and gain public recognition of her contribution in each of those roles, rather than actually confining it to her radio astronomy, I think you would say we would all benefit from understanding that contribution.
Congratulations on the inaugural Ruby Payne Scott keynote address today, and thank you very much for speaking to us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Good news, everybody. It's good news time on Lost in Science.
Great.
You don't sound so skeptical. We're going to celebrate a recent milestone. On the 5th of September 2016, this year, the World Health Organization declared that Sri Lanka is now officially malaria-free.
Really?
Yes, they have.
That is something to celebrate.
They have eradicated malaria. It's been more than 3 years since the last case in Sri Lanka. So it's that,
is that some sort of cut-off date that they had set up, or is that just?
I think that that's how they count it. And look, and there are actually, they're not the only ones. There are a few other countries that are close to eradicating malaria as well, which is really good news, and it shows what can be done. And it's really interesting in when we're in the battle against these kind of infectious diseases that still actually affect a lot of people and still are major killers in parts of the world, that there can be progress made. So, like, Sri Lanka was years ago was one of the worst affected countries by malaria, and so this is the other reason why this is, I guess, seen as a major milestone. So, a bit of history, I guess. They did have an eradication campaign about 50 years ago, back in the early in the 50s and 60s, where they were basically trying to wipe out malaria, mostly by using DDT to kill mosquitoes. And they had another medicine called, that's the word I'm looking for, medicine called chloroquine, where they were using to actually tackle the disease itself. Thing is that this campaign, it kind of ran out of money in the 60s, and by 1969 malaria had come screaming back, and
not to mention DDT being pretty bad to use would have been.
Yeah, well, there was a rising kind of tide against DDT, I suppose you could say, in the world. I did see one article on this topic that blamed the whole thing on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That kind of meme that goes around. Seems a bit
much to blame her entirely for the ban of DDT.
Yeah, look, and the facts are that it's not as simple as that, because, like I said, it was by 1969 that it had really kind of come back in Sri Lanka. They're getting at about 500,000 cases a year by that stage. Now, the US was, of course, where the book Silent Spring was published. It banned DDT in 1972, so it was still around, certainly in the developing world, long after that. And there are exceptions made for using on mosquitoes and that sort of thing. Certainly there was a bit of pressure to stop using DDT in places. But yeah, it was more that there was, I think, a reduction in the strength of the campaign they were doing. And also there was a rise in resistance to DDT as well. So the overuse of DDT in agriculture in particular caused insects to become resistant to it. Now, this was less of a problem if it was used to wipe out mosquitoes for disease control, because you're using it in a smaller scale but very intensively. But if you're using it all year round on your agricultural crops, then the insects can develop resistance, and that's by that stage, by the late 60s, early 70s, there was some DDT resistance going on, and of course, eventually there was resistance to the medicine, the chloroquine that they were using to actually treat the malaria as well. So it was a bit of a bad thing for Sri Lanka, but back in about the start of this century, they decided they were going to really get stuck into it and tackle malaria. And one of the things that is credited with being very effective was, as well as instead of just trying to eradicate the mosquitoes, they concentrated a lot on controlling the actual disease itself, controlling the parasite. So malaria being there's a little parasite that lives inside the mosquito, that the mosquito transmits from human to human. If you can successfully treat that when the case arises, then it's less likely that a mosquito will bite that person and transfer that parasite then to another person. So it became a matter of essentially having a very sophisticated system of reporting any cases that arose, of having mobile clinics to treat people in remote areas, and just really jumping on all the cases, and particularly for children and those more vulnerable populations. So that was in combination with things like the actual mosquito control and bed nets and that kind of stuff. Now the drugs that they were using by this stage is the 21st century. This is mostly artemisinin. I'm thinking I'm saying that correctly, which is a drug that was based on a Chinese traditional medicine, for which there was a Nobel Prize.
From the wormwood, from one of the wormwood plants. They found some active ingredient that worked.
Yeah, they extracted that, and that was Nobel Prize awarded in medicine for that last year. Now, it's actually normally given in a complex with other drugs to help reduce the speed that resistance is developed. There is resistance developing to it now, so it is kind of not going to last forever. They need to try and get onto this eradication as quick as they can. But the success in Sri Lanka shows that it can be done. But a lot of it, like I said, came down to the system that they put in place for the monitoring and for the control of disease. So a lot of them put down to their public health system. And of course, the fact that it's an island helps as well. But we shouldn't forget too that this is, in the years that they were doing this, there was a civil war, a rather nasty civil war going on in Sri Lanka. And so they managed to achieve these results even with that scale of sort of civil unrest.
And the tsunami.
Yeah. They also have a lot of migrant labourers come into Sri Lanka, and that was one of their big challenges, was how to keep control of new cases coming in. And so they certainly have a policy of basically just screening everyone when they arrive. They said they don't even check whether they're legal or illegal immigrants. They don't check their immigration status at all. They basically, the priority is disease control. And that's what, again, it's about the system and the processes that they put in place, it seems largely is the effective thing. So it's a good example for other countries. There are 13 other countries that have malaria countries that have reported no cases for at least a year. This includes countries like Argentina and Turkey. So they may soon be declared malaria-free as well. And there are 21 countries on a list that could be free of the disease by the end of the decade. It's said that's countries that includes China, Malaysia, Iran, a few other ones like that. So yeah, things are looking good. However, sub-Saharan Africa, which is where most of the cases are, when most of the deaths occur, and this is a disease that still kills about 400,000 people a year, mostly babies and pregnant women. They're not on the list. Generally, the sub-Saharan African countries are not on the list of where it's to be eradicated. So that's, I guess, from a global health point of view, that's where the effort needs to be put in. But you've got to say, for instance, China is, like I said, is on the list for eradicating it. And now China's a bit further north. So climate-wise, they're probably not as going to be as badly affected, but they're these are all neighbouring countries when you've got the landlocked countries, and they still can potentially achieve that. I don't know, I think it also gives a bit of hope when we're looking at things like with climate change. People have been concerned about diseases like malaria moving away from the tropical areas and spreading spreading further afield. I guess it shows that we have other ways of tackling these threats, that we can sort of face them, but we need to be pretty quick and smart about eradicating them. But make sure we apply that to the poorer countries as well.
That's all we've got time for on this episode of Lost in Science. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. Lost in Science is recorded at the studios of 3CR in Melbourne and broadcast across Australia on the Community Radio Network with the financial assistance of the Community Broadcasting Foundation. If you want to talk back to us, you can get in touch. We have a Gmail account, lostinsight@gmail. You can also find us on Twitter and on the Facebook. And if that's not enough Lost in Science for you, you can always tune in again next week, where the team will once again get Lost in Science!
Thanks for listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online.